I appreciate you coming, all of you, and I didn't have any idea who would come, so I'm glad each of you came. Bo asked me if I would be willing to share the book that I just wrote. It's Immigrants' Land, the Tangeman and Sheet Families in America, 1848 to 1880. This is by me. It's my second book. I wrote a book called Immigrants in Peril, and I don't think I have one, but it was about the patriarch of this family, starting with Carl Tangeman, and that book actually was his journey across the ocean, and he had a difficult time getting to America. In fact, he didn't make it to New York. He made it to New Orleans. After he landed in New Orleans, his wife and 2 young children died. He was left there by himself, what to do. He decided to go to New York, where his brothers were hoping that he would arrive. Anyway, the rest of that book is about his adventures. He eventually found them in Ohio. And this book picks up after the reunion of the 3 brothers. So this book picks up in 1848. Some people say, well, why are you writing these books? And Roy, you can probably relate to that, having written several books. Why are you doing this? I'm doing this. Next slide.
We'll get there. There we go.
Because of these people. This was several years ago, and I became concerned. These are my grandchildren. I became concerned that how would they know the stories from the family? The oldest in the back is Wolf. He's 20 now. If he lives another 80 years, that's going to put him way out here, closer to 100 years from me. And if I think about my father, who was born in 1914, he's way far away from Wolf and these others. So I'm in the middle. How can some of the things that I know from the past be passed on to these people? How will that happen? If not me, who? I don't know. So I started thinking about that. How are we going to turn some family stories into something meaningful for them? Next. So this is the first book I mentioned, and next. This is these people now, this last Christmas. They're getting pretty big. During the pandemic, I knitted a lot. So I knit scarves for all of them. And this is the scarf picture. They're getting pretty big. And so it was time for me to be writing the second book. And go on. This is the second book. It's called Immigrants' Land, the Tangeman and Sheep Families in America. And this story has 4 themes that come down through the generations, starting in Prussia before 1848, and then in Ohio from 1848 to 1880, and continuing on to Kansas since 1880. There are 4 themes. Let me see if I can remember them. One of them is faith. And faith ran through this family. And we'll see in some of the slides. Another one is family. They had lots of children, scads of children. So I brought this tiny little dress to symbolize family. The third one was the land. Land was always important. And you see land in the title. And the fourth one was technology. How many of you are familiar with this? Yes? What is it?
Sieve.
A scythe.
Okay, a scythe.
Scythe.
It can be a sieve.
I always say it wrong. I looked it up.
Okay.
A scythe. Yes, and this was my dad's. And I remember it, he would go out with the sunflowers, and anybody who's lived out on the the Great Plains has those wild sunflowers, and he would just go down a ditch where they were growing too wild, and he didn't want them to get into the field and get into the good crops. So he'd be out there and he'd get rid of those. At the time, I had no idea what this was. I had no idea why he was using it, although he explained that to me. But that is actually, it came down through the family, and it may have been used back in the 1880s. I can't say that for sure, but it probably was. So it represents technology. Before about 1850, this was the major way that grain crops were harvested by hand, and then someone else would gather up the stalks of wheat or rye or oats, whatever it might be, and they would bundle them into shocks to dry completely before they would, by hand, get the grains out. And then just like some of our native friends have the stone method of turning the wheat into flour. Well, before 1880, my people did much the same thing. After then, the harvesting machines were available to people, which cut down the labor tremendously. So we have those four themes. Let's go on. So the Tangeman and Sheet families left Sulligan, Hanover, Prussia, and Einigen, Böblingen, Württemberg in 1846 to 1853. There's a group of people. Didn't you like how I said all those words?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. The land near Sulligan. I took this photo, by the way. We made a trip to Germany several years ago when I was doing some of these research items. The land is very much like the land I grew up on, pretty flat. Now, some people say, "Ooh, Kansas, you get on I-70, you drive across it, it's flat, it's boring, blah, 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 blah." Well, fields like this look really good to wheat farmers. They don't look good to mountain climbers. They look terrible, but they look really good to wheat farmers.
But that's
Okay,
pretty.
let's go on.
That's beautiful.
It is. And I mentioned the church and faith. This is the Evangelisch Deutschland Kirche in Sulligan, Hanover, Prussia. This is where Carl Tangeman was baptized, and where some family members still attend and have weddings and celebrations. You know, we probably have too much light in here. You're not seeing this very well, are you? Okay, let me turn this off.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's better. All right, next. These are family members that we found. Actually, I had contact with the woman in the center. Her name is Silka, and her parents are Helga and Fritz, and Jim and I were visiting them in Sulligan.
Nice.
So we were able to make that connection. Family is a big part of the family I'm in, the Tangeman family.
And tell us about the
Next.
sign. Is that on their house or?
Oh, okay, well, it's on their, could you go back? It's Tangeman's Hofladen. Hofladen means store. They had a small farm. They had eggs and they had some meats and cheeses and things that they sold. There was a little doorbell. So as we were visiting in the house, the Hofladen was actually just a part of the house, on one side of the house. And so the bell would ring, and then one family member would go over and sell the eggs or the meat or the cheese or whatever. And then in about 10 minutes, they'd be back and rejoin. So yes, they had a store, if you will. Next. And technological change. As I've shown you, the scythe, the traditional harvesting tool used before the invention of McCormick harvesting machines. The first one was in 1832, but they didn't become prominent until after about 1850. So from the old country to the new country, people boarded ships like this. And this is a pretty frightful image to me. I mean, I just have to hand it to them. They had the courage to get on that ship. They also must have had some other powerful motivators. And certainly we know that. We know that there was food shortage. There was a shortage of ways to make a living. The economic part was very short. Some people left Europe because of religious reasons. So there were a lot of reasons to get on that ship, but still, you had to have a lot of courage to actually do it.
And $5 gas.
$5 gas would do it for you?
Yeah.
Okay. Next. The Tangeman and Sheets in Ohio. So between 1848 and 1880, not only the three brothers that I've already mentioned, but I discovered three of their sisters, who then were in Cincinnati, Ohio. The Sheets are wives of two of the Tangeman brothers. Come and have a seat. Come and have a seat. No problem.
I'm probably moving too.
That's okay. Sorry. The Sheets were two sisters married to two Tangeman brothers. They used to do that back then. But in addition to those two Sheet sisters, we found an additional two Sheet brothers. So now we have 4 siblings in the Sheet family, 6 siblings in the Tangeman family. And that was pretty typical. That, and we call it the immigrant generation. And those are the folks who could remember their parents, who could tell stories about their parents. And they were the grandparents back in the old country that their children would never meet. So again, they were that middle generation connecting the older and the younger. Next. The land, as I mentioned. This is a cornfield in Ashland County, Ohio. I made a trip to Ohio and took photos and lurked around in courthouse basements, researching property that was owned by various family members so that I could trace where they lived and where they went. So Ashland County was a place that Carl Tangeman and his brother Wilhelm actually lived and farmed up until 1880. Wilhelm was there farming for about 14 years, and Carl was farming for about 8 years before they decided to move west. For anybody who's been on my website, you may have seen this slide before. Actually, I wrote one chapter in the book based upon the terrain in Ohio. What struck me was, and this is very close to the property that Carl actually owned. This is not great farmland. This is not. This is something that you buy when you can't buy anything else. And indeed, Carl bought property like that. And so because of the terrain, it was difficult to farm. So one of the little tiny stories that's come down through the generation to me that my father told me was when it would have been his great-grandfather, Carl, came out to Kansas, what he was looking for was flat land. He was sick and tired of trying to farm these hills. They're kind of nice to live in. You know, they're kind of pretty. You have some trees, you have some little variation, but not good for farming. So my dad told me one of the things they were looking for was flat land. And I put in this picture of the First Presbyterian Church in Hayesville, Ohio. Hayesville is like, this church is about 2.5 miles from where Carl lived, maybe 3 miles from where his brother lived. And I believe this would have been the church they attended because of proximity, but also, and I'm so glad Bill is here because if need be, he can fill in the gaps about church history. But I believe the tradition of the Presbyterian church would fit rather well from what I've read with the evangelical folks back in Germany.
Do you think it had, did you talk to anybody about whether it originally had a steeple on it?
I did not. Okay. And this was entering Hayesville, that little village that had the church. Again. And the Vermilion Institute. This still exists. I took this picture. The Vermilion Institute was actually a school where several members of the Tangeman families, the two farm families, sent their children to school. In addition, Carl's oldest was a teacher. He was a math teacher here, and his girlfriend, fiance, whom he eventually married, was also a teacher at this school. Education has always been a thread in the family. Not everybody has taken advantage of the educational opportunities they've had, but many, many have. And so it's a common thread. And this is an antique barn in Ashland County, Ohio. I just like the picture. I took it. Okay. This is a barn that was built in 1827. So when the Tangemans arrived in Ashland County, they would have seen this barn. I thought that was cool. Yes. Go ahead. This is a street scene in Over the Rhine in Cincinnati, Ohio. Closer to 1850, those 6 Tangeman siblings and 4 Sheet siblings all lived in Cincinnati. And just like today, when immigrants come, they cluster together. Same pattern. Doesn't matter what ethnicity you are. It's the same pattern for safety and for comfort. You cluster together. And so I took this picture. These are the historic buildings. The cars obviously are modern, but these historic buildings were much like they had been. This is in a state of transition, gentrification. A lot of people are moving there now. It's kind of a cool place, but it was really a slum in the 1800s. And I put this in the Cincinnati Reds, the first professional baseball team in 1869 because I like baseball. And I thought that was neat.
Bill is from Cincinnati. Did you know that?
No, I did not. Is this familiar to you at all?
It is. I mean, my family came over at the same time. They came to Cincinnati, which was a significant German community, which is interesting because it says something about the communications between here and there. So people who were coming over knew that there was this German community in southeastern or southwestern Ohio, and they gravitated to that point.
Also, a big draw for those fresh immigrants from Germany and other places. A big draw was the meatpacking plants. That at that time, there were always jobs available for people. And so it was one of those places like now, some immigrants have been resettled in this country, not coincidentally, near chicken processing plants, other places where a person without necessarily any English can learn something and do it and have a job and put food on the table. So it was very similar in Cincinnati.
And the Over the Rhine district is near the University of Cincinnati. And so a lot of students lived there when I was there in the 70s, but even then it was beginning to, upgrade in terms of yuppies coming in and, renovating that area. So it was a fairly poor section of town then, and then suddenly became a very desirable section of town.
Right, close in, walk to everything, nice restaurants, coffee shops, all of that. Yes, Susan?
I'm a retired librarian and I read a lot, and this is kind of the story of all the immigrants, whether they went to New York, Evergreen, or New Orleans. Right, like you said, they're downtown and then they succeed, and these neighborhoods are still there if someone wants to go look at their background.
Exactly.
But there's a lot of books written on this.
There are.
Yeah.
This is not a unique story. It's our story. And in fact, I would agree with you that many families when I've given book talks before with my first book, inevitably people come up to me afterwards and say, oh, that reminds me of my Aunt Tilly from Sweden. And I thought, really? And have you written down the story of Aunt Tilly from Sweden? And they said, not yet, but I think I'm gonna go dig out that shoebox and see what I can put together for the next generation. Okay. Oh,
just
did we
curious,
talk about?
Pardon my
yeah.
ignorance, do you happen to know what the origin of the team name, the Reds, the Cincinnati Reds comes from?
I do not.
There were the red legs originally.
Oh, the red
That's
stockings.
White
Red
socks,
stocking.
red legs, red stockings.
Oh.
Okay,
He used to have a round rug that said, and that was the leggings, or stocking, leggings. Yeah, a baseball.
so
Okay,
they
this
were
is,
before the Red Sox then, obviously. Okay,
yes. Okay, this is Findlay Market. I took a photo of it because it had been around for a very long time. It opened for business in the early 1850s, and there's this, just a slight reference to it in this book, yes. Okay, harvesting wheat. We were talking about technology changing, and I would draw a parallel between what was happening in agriculture and mining. It wasn't just agriculture, but agriculture, mining, and manufacturing was just undergoing this enormous evolution change in the 1850s to 1900. We're going through a similar, just almost overwhelming pace of change. I mean, if I didn't have Rachel, I would have been dead in the water this morning with the technology to show this. Thank you. So this is an example of the McCormick harvesting machine. Next. Advertisement to entice pioneers to Kansas. I have no doubt there were so many of these all over the East, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, all through those areas. If you want a farmer home, the best thing in the West, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad lands in Southwest Kansas, good soil for wheat, corn, and fruit. Best stock country in the world. I mean, how could you stay home when you were enticed to go to this place? Carl and Anna Barbara Tangeman, William and Margaret Tangeman, and 16 of their children migrated from Ohio to Kansas in 1880. And I included this quilt because it is actually from another thread in my family, but I believe it was made in the 1890s, which would have been close to this time period. So I thought I would just bring that to show you. Next. The first Santa Fe Depot, Newton, Kansas, 1872. And so this is likely the depot that they found when they arrived. They did not come in a covered wagon. They did not need to. I have other people, other stories about covered wagons I could draw upon, but this part of the family had stayed in Ohio until they had enough resource to actually go and purchase property right away. And so there's no way I believe, and there's no story about getting in a covered wagon. That did not happen. They came on the train, okay? This is a view of Main Street looking south from 526 North Main in Newton, Kansas in 1882. And so you can see this was a thriving little place. And when you think about 1882, in 1871, it was known as the wildest town in the West because of the cattle drives and the cowboys and coming in the saloons. They had like 24 saloons, and I mean, and they had a sheriff, but it was rough and ready. It was definitely, it reminds me of a lot of the stories about Durango, a very rough and ready place. But just 11 years later, this is what we have. Okay. Home on the range in the 1880s, there were buffalo. Many, 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 many herds, thousands of buffalo. And of course, we have all discovered now that eradicating buffalo was a policy of the US government to actually eradicate the culture of the natives. But In the 1800s, there were these buffalo. Yes. The land. This is the land that Carl found. And it's nice and flat. Very flat. That's what they wanted. That's what they found. And it's very productive. It's rich land. A shock of wheat made in the process of harvesting by machine. That was the shock. Go ahead. And back to the thread of the church. So we had the big brick church in Sullivan. We had the white frame church in Hayesville, Ohio. And this is Highland Church, which is at Dutch and Anderson Avenues in Harvey County. And this is the Trinity United Church of Christ, which should be no surprise, right, Bill? Right. So these same people brought their, generally speaking, their same faith where they landed in Kansas. Okay. This is the barn in which the Tangemans lived for a time. This is Tilly and Anna Barbara. So this is Anna Barbara, who would be my great-great-grandmother. Carl's wife, her maiden name was Sheep, and this is her daughter Tilly.
A border collie.
Yeah. She was quite, Anna Barbara was quite the woman. She had 9 children. Well, that's a lot right there. The first 5 were boys. And they were rambunctious boys. I have no doubt about it. Rambunctious boys. And then she had 2 girls. Tilly was one of the 2 girls. And then 1 more boy and then 1 more girl. But the five boys, first boys, really put their stamp on the family and their experience in Kansas. Okay. This was Carl and Anna Barbara Sheets' home place, catty-cornered across from the Highland Church we just saw, Dutch Avenue and Anderson Avenue, Highland Township, Harvey County. Okay.
So do you think they built that house
Oh, they did.
when they came?
Oh, they did. In
Wow.
fact, I didn't include the slide in this show, but there's a house, go back to that house, okay? There, that's Italianate something style. And this house bears a very close resemblance to a good friend of Carl's back in Ohio. And we have a picture of that house. And when you look at that house, you look at this house, they were very close friends. And so I think this was, okay, now I have arrived where I'm going to live out my life, and I'm going to build the house that will accommodate my family throughout my life. And this is what we built. It was very common in that time to have houses like this. Yes. Okay. Our field is the world. This is the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company in Chicago. And their motto was, our field is the world. And this machine really, technologically, it turned agriculture upside down and made it possible for so many people to leave agriculture, move into the cities, get jobs. I mean, it really had a tremendous impact on life. It was that little old machine. This is a view of Highland Cemetery adjacent to the Highland Church. Carl and Anna Barbara are here. My parents are here. My brother, who just passed away a few months ago, is here. Many other relatives, the people I saw when I was a child and I went to Tangeman reunions, many of those people I saw are now in this cemetery. And at the very end of my book, I do have a little reflection from this spot.
Did they have a big barren plot? Or are they all over the cemetery?
It's all of
That
them.
is the family plot.
Yeah, that's the family plot.
Okay.
In fact, there may be a few people who are not related. I don't know. There may be a few people, but virtually all those people are part of this
Extended family.
extended family.
Who cares for that?
What?
Who cares? Because
Oh.
it's very well known.
Oh, yes, it's very well maintained. It's a family member.
Okay.
I met him not too long ago. I'll tell just this little story. So my parents, many years ago, bought plots in Highland Cemetery. They decided that's where we want to be, that's where our parents are, blah, blah, blah. So they bought their 2 plots. And then, and my parents lived a very long time. They lived to be 94, 98. So they had many, many years to think about things. After they had their 2 plots, they thought, oh, we'll just go ahead and buy 2 more. Okay, they bought 2 more. And then they talked, and kind of the way it goes is that the sons in the family have a tendency to end up in the cemetery where their parents were. And so they talked to my older brother and they said, we bought 2 extra plots and we'd like you and Becky to have them. Thank you very much, Dad. That's very thoughtful. We appreciate it. Blah, blah, blah. This is years ago, you know. And then a couple of years later, they talked to my younger brother and they said, Tim, we'd really like you and Karen to have these 2 extra plots. And Tim, thank you very much, Mom and Dad. We appreciate it. That's a lovely thought. We know we won't need them anytime soon, but thank you so much. Then we were together, the siblings were together, and we started talking about, wasn't that interesting how Mom and Dad bought the 2 extra plots? And it came out
This was after they were gone.
What?
This was after your parents were gone.
and so it came out that Mom and Dad had verbally given both of these extra plots to my
Everybody.
2 brothers and their wives. And, you know, in typical, you know, my brother's fashion, they said, okay, this is the deal. Whoever needs it first gets it. So my brother is now there.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. See, and this is the end, sunset, in my home county. So do you have any questions?
Were you always storytellers in your family? I mean, were there somebody,
Um,
or did you just ask the right questions?
Okay, I didn't bring it, but actually in 1939, this family started having reunions. 1939. And in 1971, they commissioned the historian and another person in the family to write a genealogy, to compile it, put it together. So we have, not only was it so-and-so was born and died and married and divorced or adopted or died or whatever, not only all of that material, but they sent out an invitation to all the older people at that time to write things about the older generation from them. And so they wrote these stories about what Christmas was like at Grosspapa's house, and just all kinds of stories that I have drawn upon to write. So yeah, the stories were there. And then, you know, when you're in a big family and you're kind of together, people just start talking about things. And if you're the little kid, you absorb it. So it was more that. It wasn't, okay, we're gonna have story time. No, it was just around the Thanksgiving table or, you know, that kind of storytelling, I would have to say mostly. And then I was kind of a curious, pesky kid who did ask my parents things.
And the reunions are still going on.
Yeah,
We
this
just
reunions
came
are
back from one.
We just got
About
back.
70, 80 people.
70,
were
80
there.
people showed up of the 1,100 plus living
Living.
descendants of Carl and Anna Barbara. Any other questions?
Where are they held?
They're held in Newton, Kansas.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know if they moved them around.
Some of the
or-
family farm stuff.
Could you go down about 3 or 4 slides? No, forward.
You know,
Is there anything more on that group of slides? Okay, So this was just no, okay. Anyway, okay, so yes, it's in Newton, Kansas, and I have a third cousin who lives on this small farm, what would you say, 10 or 15 acres? It's right in town. Town is going up around it, but it's got a huge barn, and then he has like a Quonset barn that he usually keeps his tractors and things in. So he moves the tractors out and sweeps it all out, we put in tables, and that's where we have it. So, yeah, it's great. It's great. We have a wiener roast on Friday night, then we all get together. We had a birthday party for Carl because he was 201 years old. That was the anniversary of his birth. So we had a cake. It was great fun. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing you wanted to do.
Did I say I wanted to read it? Do I have time to read one thing?
Something right at the end.
There's 10 minutes.
Oh. Yes, okay, I could read that. I'll just mention, one of my grandchildren, Ephraim, who is a very curious sort, with my first book, he said, "Grandma, what's real and what's not real?" Because I write historical fictions and people talk to one another and all of that. So it's a historical fiction. "Grandma, what's real and what's not real?"
Yeah.
You can tell you.
He loves the real stuff.
It was the real stuff. And so I put a section in the back of the first book about the historical events that were in this book. And in this one also, I go chapter by chapter, and all of the real stuff is noted.
Oh, yeah.
Births, deaths, all of that. All of that. Okay. Okay. All right. I'll read this last paragraph. Should I read this last paragraph? Okay. So there's the book, and then there's an epilogue that tells, quote unquote, the real story about what happened to these people in their lives after the book. So people can kind of get a little picture of that. And the very last paragraph I wrote, a few years ago in June, I visited my parents' graves in Highland Cemetery, Highland Township. Across the ripening wheat fields, I recalled how they had farmed the land, raised our family, and routinely supported community organizations. Shadyside and Golden Plains schools, Highland Grange, Highland 4-H Club, churches, and others benefited from their time and commitment to their community. While in this place of crops and wind and fully open skies, I reflected on the turning of seasons, the rhythm of planting, harvesting, and preparing for next year's crops. After nearly a century on the land, my parents chose Highland Cemetery to return to the sheltering earth. They now rest several paces from the grave markers of Dad's forebears, Anna Tangeman Duke, his mother, Fred Tangeman, his grandfather, and Carl and Anna Barbara Tangeman, his great-grandparents. So, that's
The rest of the story.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Until the next book comes out.
No time soon. I said that to my sister. I don't see one coming anytime really soon. Roy, you can relate to that, right? You finished the book and it's like, yeah. But there are other stories to tell.
Oh, sure.
No question about it, but I don't know if I'll be the one to
It's just
tell.
one side of your family, right?
Oh, yeah, this is just
Just the
one.
one, yeah.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Cheryl, I find it interesting that there was this stream from Germany at that time because my paternal great-grandfather and my maternal great-grandfather both came over with other family members at that exact same time.
Mhm.
And my paternal grandfather, they lived, and we lived for the first few years of my life, a couple of years from Findlay Market, a couple of miles from Findlay Market. So that area, I mean, coming from diverse places in Germany and
Mhm.
centering in one particular area.
Yes, it was a steady stream. It was thousands, even millions of people who were coming to the United States. And then a large portion of them were coming through Ohio, through Cincinnati. And they didn't stay. They came and then they moved on west. The ones who bought farms in Ohio, it was typical for them to buy the farm. Maybe I could buy 40 acres. Okay, I'll buy my 40 acres. Now, I'll farm it for a couple of years, and then I hear about, oh, I could buy 80 acres in Indiana. I think I'll go there. And then after a few years, oh, I could buy 120 acres out in Iowa. Okay. Anyway, and so they did that. They had several jumps. And of course, agriculture was one thing, but then there were the shopkeepers, there were all the people who populated those little towns along the way. Not all those people made it. They might stay for a generation. And now we know that that part of the country is depleting in population and people moving to the coasts. But back then, people were pouring into the middle of the country.
And technology was playing a role here also. A farmer who's cutting wheat like this, 40 acres is a lot to handle. As the technology changed, they could handle more and more land. So you wanted to go where you could
Have
get that
more
space.
opportunity,
Yeah.
yes.
And
Yes.
so, Cheryl didn't mention it, but Carl Tanchman and Anna Barbara wanted to have 80 acres for each of their children.
Oh. Yes, that was their
That was
goal.
their family goal.
And they achieved that. Before Carl passed, they gave each of their children 80 acres because that was their beginning. That was their stake in the future. And the family was very long, took a long view. So we're giving our children this land so they will be able to support their families on into the future. And land would stay. Land was something that would not fritter away. It would stay. So that, yes, thank you. Anything else? Any other questions?
I'm sure they were glad they had all those boys.
You know,
Yeah.
having those
People like
5
it.
boys made a huge difference, and they all became farmers. And they all were in Highland Township. They made a very great imprint on that community.
Well, when you went to school, elementary school.
Oh, yeah. So I went
almost
to the
everybody
one
was-
school, everybody except one family I was related to.
Well, I was just thinking, you may even be related at some point in the line. This group, but they were there at the same time in the same.
Not
places.
unless Bill recognizes these names.
No.
Well, and yours came from
Mine
a different
were
place.
Whitebrecht or
Yes.
Weinbrecht or Postler, so they didn't have any overlap.
Yeah, I don't think so. Yes.
My mom's whole family is descended from, her ancestry is also completely German. And they came over, I think it was my great grandfather and great grandmother. They came over and ended up in Wisconsin. So I guess that kind of fits the narrative of they started in Ohio and kept going west. So Wisconsin was another one of those Midwestern
Were they
states.
Lutheran?
They were.
Yes.
How did you know that?
German Lutherans went north into
Ah.
Wisconsin,
Yeah.
Minnesota, the Dakotas, and the Reformed Germans, evangelical Germans, went south into Cincinnati and then into the Midwest. And then they became Presbyterians or UCC because there weren't very many evangelical Reformed churches.
Yeah.
So I mean, even the streams, diverted based on ethnic culture.
I
Right.
started out my young life as a Lutheran. So there you go.
There you go. Yes, yes. Well, thank you for coming.
Well,
I
thank you.
appreciate
It's
it.
interesting.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, they've all been doctors.